Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I Never Told You, production of iHeartRadio. And it's time for another edition of Female First, which means we are once again so happy to be joined by the amazing, the adaptable Yves. Welcome, Yves.
Thank you.
Adaptable. That's a good word for you right now.
Well, thank you. That's high praise, honestly.
Yes.
It makes me feel very human to call me adaptable, though. So I feel like y'all are too, for sure. But I'm like, ooh, I'm in my full primitive human element if I'm adaptable, you know?
Well, Yves is currently podcasting from a car, everyone. And I won't even go to the office because I'd have to unplug my work laptop. And that's too much for me. I'm adaptable in some ways, but in other ways, I'm like, no. Yes, well, Yves, we know you've been up to some traveling, up to some stuff. Can you tell us, how have you been? What have you been up to?
I've been good. I was recently in Guatemala for a wedding. That's probably the last little bit of travel that I did. And I actually had a really good time there. I wanted to be there longer, but because of schedule, it's like graduation season for me and I have some family stuff going on. I needed to be back in the home space, but it was good. I was there for about a week. I got to hike. I get to be outside, as y'all know. I like to do a lot. I hiked a volcano called Acatenango and spent the night on it, and that was really fun. But in general, it's a beautiful place. I got to see Antigua and spend some time there, and would love to go back at some point and dig into more things. I looked at books while I was there, but I didn't have the space to bring back any with me. So I would love to go back and actually purchase some books next time I'm there.
I love that. That's so great that that's like, I must go back to get some books.
Well, I found a lot of cool ones when I was there. So ones about like mythology, about the legends of, the country, and ones about time, ones about the supernatural, ones. I mean, there were a lot of cool books there. There were political books. I mean, just all kind of things. I saw some cool ones. I just didn't have any space for it. And so I just walked away with my head down and my tail between my legs. And I was like, I don't have any room. But it's fine.
One day, Yves. I believe in you. I think you'll be back. Well, since we know that there's a threat of rain, we'll go ahead and jump into the episode. So, Yves, who did you bring for us to talk?
Today, we are talking about Hide Hyodo Shimizu, and she was the first Nisei, which means child of Japanese-born immigrants, to teach in the British Columbia school system. But everything that happened in her life, how she contributed to the school system in British Columbia, delved into a lot of other social things that were going on at the time in British Columbia's history. So work she did was important. Looking forward to getting into her story today.
Yes, there is a lot to unpack here with her story. So shall we get started with the history?
Yeah. So Hide was born on May 11th, 1908 in Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. She was the oldest of 8 children that were born to her parents who had immigrated to Canada from Uwajima, Japan. That's how she was second generation Nisei, as you'll hear that word later on in the episode too. And they referred to other second generation Japanese Canadians the same way. But yeah, so her parents came from Uwajima, Japan, and they planned to move to Boston in the United States and were on their way there when they made it to Vancouver, but they decided to stay in Vancouver. And Hide ended up going to Laura Secord Elementary School, where she was the only non-white student in her class. And she later went to John Oliver High School. And then she went to the University of British Columbia for a year. In 1925, she ended up transferring to Vancouver Normal School. And in 1926, she got her teacher's certificate. So she was one of the first Nisei to get a teacher's certificate at the time. So there was another teacher that was already teaching a first grade class at Lord Byng Elementary School in Steveston, which is now a part of Richmond, British Columbia. But there were many Japanese immigrants in the community that spoke Japanese. That teacher resigned. Hide applied for the job in the fall and got it. The school board assumed that she spoke Japanese, even though she didn't. Hide's parents spoke Japanese, but Hide didn't grow up around a lot of Japanese Canadians. She actually didn't know a lot of Japanese people. And that's how Hide ended up becoming the first Nisei to teach in the British Columbia school system, which, of course, it was impressive because at the time, there was a lot of anti-Japanese and general anti-Asian sentiment in British Columbia and Canada. It was prevalent, and it made, of course, getting jobs difficult for people of Japanese descent. But Hide also taught overflow classes because Lord Byng was crowded, so they had to have overflow classes at other schools. But either way, this is the beginning of Hide's story at Lord Byng. I wish I had more single stories of Hide teaching there and stories from her students, which may be there because some of her documents are collected. However, I don't know how many of those exist. But she taught there for a long time. So this is the beginning of that story. She ended up teaching there for 16 years. But consider that 16 years, and then there were things that happened in the meantime. So in the meantime, Hide was becoming socially involved with organizations. She worked with the Powell Street United Church. She worked with the Japanese Canadian Citizens League. Not fully sure what her impetus was for being involved. Like what was her drive to become so socially involved? I'm not fully sure, but she started becoming involved with these organizations. And the JCCL was an organization of Japanese Canadians who advocated for citizenship and the right to vote. And because Japanese Canadians couldn't vote in British Columbia. And after the Dominion Elections Act was passed, they lost the federal right to vote in 1920. But either way, later on, because of her involvement in these organizations, in 1936, the JCCL, once again, that's the Japanese Canadian Citizens League, they invited her to join a 4-person delegation to Ottawa to advocate for the right to vote. So on May 22nd of that year, 1936, she went before the Elections and Franchise Acts Committee in the House of Commons, which was considering lifting the ban. The other 3 delegates that went with her were men. So they were a dentist, a life insurance agent, and a professor, and of course, Hide, who was a teacher. And later on, Hide said that women weren't included in discussions at the time, but the JCCL thought that one of the 4 delegates should be a woman because they were going in front of this panel of white people and that would help influence them, basically. But she and the other people who were presenting each had 15 minutes to make their presentations about extending voting rights to Japanese Canadians. I believe that Hide was the first to go up. Unfortunately, it didn't go well. The committee decided against extending the vote, and the delegation went back to Vancouver. And on June 5th, they announced the news to a public meeting of about 300 people that it didn't go well. And Hide did, though, create a scrapbook of her time there, which is pretty cool. There's a short video on it on YouTube. It's now in the Nikkei National Museum, which has access to her documents. So you can go look at some of that there. Even better, I'm imagining you could probably see some of that stuff in person if it's possible. But yes, so Japanese Canadians, as well as Chinese and South Asian residents, still couldn't vote. Japanese Canadians wouldn't be able to vote in Canada until 1948, in British Columbia until 1949. So keep that in the back of your mind. This effort continues throughout these years. Although they didn't necessarily win the fight in this moment, this experience did uplift Hide as an advocate for Japanese Canadians' rights. And so this is when we get to a little bit of the larger story around the beginning of World War II. So if people who are listening are familiar with American history, then they know about the internment of the Japanese in the United States around this time. So In Canada, there was also a history of anti-Japanese, anti-Asian sentiment, anti-Japanese detainment. So in the months leading up to the outbreak of World War II, this anti-Japanese sentiment, the distrust of Japanese Canadians, interpersonal acts, policy against Japanese Canadians, all of that was brewing and stewing. Anti-Japanese propaganda and racism prevailed over dissenting voices. So, of course, there were people who were like, not rocking with it. All the Japanese Canadians, y'all need to be persecuted. And then there were people who were like, this is clearly racism. This is unfair. And you shouldn't be persecuting Japanese Canadians because of it. But when World War II began, there were many people of Japanese descent in Canada, and about 2/3 of them were citizens. But when Canada declared war on Japan after Pearl Harbor, some people called for Japanese people to be detained. And of course, there were other people who were saying that's cruel and unnecessary. And in Ottawa, for instance, some of the persecution that was happening to Japanese Canadians at the time. In Ottawa, anyone naturalized after 1922 had to report to the Registrar of Enemy Aliens. There were more than 1,000 Japanese Canadian fishing boats that were impounded. Japanese language newspapers were shut down. And the Superintendent of Education in British Columbia ordered that all Japanese language schools were to be closed. So John Hart, the British Columbia Premier, and George S. Pearson, who was the British Columbia Cabinet Minister, they pushed the federal government to punish Japanese Canadians. And in 1941, Hide and other Japanese Canadians older than 16 had to register with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So everything's escalating, and that is affecting Hide herself and her family. Her family lost their 10-lot parcel of land and their belongings. Well, let me not say lost, because that makes it seem like they just went into the ether. They were confiscated. And Japanese Canadians were sent away from the coast of British Columbia, and Japanese Canadians were brought to Hastings Park in Vancouver. That included children. Every other day when Hide would finish teaching in Steveston, she would go to Hastings Park to supervise education. And then she would get back home by curfew, which was 9 p.m. at the time for Japanese Canadians. So imagine like having a long day with all these students, and you're going to work and spend time helping the students every day. But then she still had the energy and the willpower and the motivation and the care, clearly, to go to the park and continue to help students because she cared that much about the education that they were getting, and she clearly knew that it was important. And so on February 24th, 1942, the federal government used the War Measures Act to pass Ordering Council PC 1486 to allow the government to detain Japanese Canadians. A few months later, Hide ended up leaving her job at Lord Byng to work at Hastings Park. But Japanese Canadians were being forced to relocate to detention camps or labor camps. And the British Columbia Security Commission was the federal agency that was over rounding up and detaining Japanese Canadians. So families were split up, as if this wasn't bad enough. Men were split up from their families. They were sent to road camps, and there was a group called the Nisei Mass Evacuation Group that was organized by Japanese Canadian men that pressed people to resist registering for road camp. But the BC Security Commission, BC as in British Columbia, you might hear me say later on BC, I'm just saying British Columbia. But yeah, the BC Security Commission still split up the families. People who were resisting were arrested, as the story goes, and many were sent to prisoner of war camps illegally. And more than 12,000 Japanese Canadians were detained in camps in the interior of British Columbia. So I can, only imagine how Hide was feeling at the time, how much chaos and harm was being caused, how much devastation there was to the Japanese Canadian community in the midst of a war. So Hide still, though, continued her fight for education. In October of 1942, she was forced to be on a train as she was being expelled from Vancouver. The British Columbia government refused to give funding to education or provide teachers for the Japanese Canadian children, even though they were supposed to. The New Canadian, which was a Japanese Canadian paper, said this: the British Columbia provincial government should continue to bear its share in educational costs, just as it had been doing for over 40 years before Pearl Harbor and in accordance with its constitutional responsibility. The New Canadian was one of the papers that was not shut down at the time. But churches and the British Columbia Teachers Federation helped that cause of providing support for the education of Japanese Canadians. So Hide wasn't alone. She helped, though, organize a school at an internment camp near Hope, British Columbia. Then she was expelled to an internment camp in New Denver, British Columbia, and she stayed there for a few years, living in a house with a couple of other women. But she still continued her work. She traveled to other internment camps to supervise education, and she worked with the JCCL under the supervision of the British Columbia Securities Commission to develop a school system for the children in internment camps. There was another Japanese Canadian who she worked with named Terry Hidaka, who had a teacher's certification, but she hadn't worked in the school system yet before. But they still organized training for high school educated Japanese Canadians in the camp to become teachers. The British Columbia Securities Commission said that they could only teach in English, though. Still, somewhere around 200 people got this training over the course of internment. Hide also got together supplies and equipment for the classroom, and she fought for better classroom conditions, teacher training, and wages. But in the midst of Hide doing all of this work, there were still more and new. The discrimination that was already there continued, and then more policy was enacted to further that discrimination. Very sadly, in January of 1943, an order was enacted that allowed officials to sell property owned by Japanese Canadians. So they were ripped away from their homes. Their families were split up. They were put into labor camps and internment camps. And then their property was sold. All kinds of property. That included companies, homes, boats, farms, personal items, all of the lot. Very hurtful, obviously. I can only imagine how that felt. But as the war's ending, Japanese Canadians are still facing this discrimination and policy. So in 1944, Japanese Canadians in British Columbia were forced to go to Japan or move east of the Rockies. They couldn't go back to the coast. Japan announced its surrender in World War II in August of 1945. That surrender was made official in September of 1945. And in the summer of 1945, Hide's work as an education supervisor for the internment camps ended. Still, though, for Japanese Canadians, people in it's not like all of a sudden everything was healed, and it became a magical place for Japanese Canadians, of course. People in British Columbia there were still interpersonal things. So people in British Columbia were still hostile and racist. They were stripped of their belongings and property there, so there wasn't much that they had to return to. And still, the British Columbia and federal government were working in cahoots to bar Japanese Canadians from coming back to the province. They still didn't want them there. And Japanese Canadians had to build new lives elsewhere. So it's one of those things where it's like, oh, God, we can talk all day about how resilient people are who were marginalized and face oppression. And of course they were, but it was because they had to be. So they did build new lives elsewhere, but it was because they were forced away from the province. And it was because of the devastation that happened. It was because they lost everything and they had to start over. So Hide left New Denver and moved to Ontario where her family was. Then she ended up going to Toronto. And in 1948, she married Reverend Kosaburo Shimizu. And he had been in an internment camp in British Columbia as well. His ex-wife had died, but he already had 4 children. So Hide became their stepmother. And in Toronto, Hide was involved with the Nisei Church, with the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, and with the Momiji Healthcare Society. And Japanese Canadians were banned from British Columbia until 1949. But Hide's work was recognized over the course of her life. She was, in June of 1982, she was made a member of the Order of Canada by the Governor General. In 1990, she became the first president of the new organization Ghost Town Teachers Historical Society, which recorded the stories of teachers in the Japanese internment camps. She had realized that that kind of initiative was necessary when she saw that a lot of the documents related to internment camp education in the archives were official documents, which obviously didn't provide a large scope of view of what people were going through at the time. It was an incomplete picture of people's stories, so she wanted to rectify that, and this was the initiative that she took to try to do so. And in 1997, Lord Byng Elementary School dedicated a rock garden in her honor. And 2 years later, on August 22nd, 1999, in Ontario, Hide died when she was 91 years old. And that's all of Hide's story.
It's a lot to unpack, as I said, in her story. And it paints like so much, just her life demonstrates so many other bigger things. But it's going back to what you said, Yves, is like, it's so frustrating that she had to go through this, that she was resilient. But it is, I don't know, like, nice isn't quite the word, but I'm glad she was there to, like, I want to make sure this education is happening. I want to make sure that kids are getting this. So it is one of those things where it's, like, incredibly frustrating, but you're glad there are people there that care that much.
Yeah.
And also, yeah, kind of still relevant. Freaky.
Yeah. Yeah. The importance of education, I guess, is something that's really urgent to talk about right now. But yeah, it was like, clearly, like, there was also a limited pool of people who could do the job that Hide was doing at the time, because she was already one of very few people who are Japanese Canadians specifically who were doing the job of educating children. And so, yeah, it's pretty inspiring to see that Hide took that into account clearly and took initiative on it to the point where she was traveling from place to place. I imagine seeing a lot of horrors, like things that were also very emotionally tough for her to deal with as she was teaching. But obviously there was a bigger cause beyond herself. And it seems like that's very front and center in the work that she was doing, that, like, there was something that she put before her own needs and comfort to be able to do this work. And very important. It's still a lot of it is very sad, but if she wouldn't have done the work that she did do, then those kids would have gone without being educated during that time. So it's nice that she was able to provide that in that way and organize people in that way.
Right. It's interesting because I've not heard the perspective, like what the Canadians did during this time. We know, like you said earlier, a lot of some of, not a lot, but some of the history that happened in the U.S. with the internment camps and what happened to the Japanese community. It's interesting to see what it looks like in Canada, where we were like, oh, they're so nice.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently not. They're just as
right.
faulty as we are.
That is a very good point to bring up, I think, Samantha, because I think the United States looks to Canada as this place to hail as doing really well by like Indigenous peoples. Not saying across the board, just like in comparison to the United States sometimes. I've heard, Americans talk about Canada like it's this place that is a little step up from the United States in terms of how they treat marginalized people. And it was not that way. And British Columbia, specifically within Canada, was a really horrible place, enacted really horrible things. And there were differences between the way that Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians were treated during this wartime. Like, for instance, how we talked about how the property was taken away from them in British Columbia. I don't think it happened exactly the same way in the United States. I think the Japanese Canadians had to pay for their internment, and it worked a little bit differently with Japanese Americans. I mean, I'm sure a scholar of that time period, specifically Japanese Americans during wartime, would be able to speak to that much better than I would. But there were differences, and in some of those cases, things were more harsh. Not like we're playing Oppression Olympics or anything like that, but it's just like, my point is to kind of go against what you were saying, Samantha. It's like, it's not just all better in Canada. Right. And indeed, sometimes it was worse, if there is any scale of ways to like compare these things.
Right. The widespread hate, like it exists no matter what. It's kind of one of those things where it spreads very quickly, the conspiracy theories. And then like when it comes to white supremacy, they're going to win out. They're going to do their best way to take advantage of every situation. And we know this. And we know that Canada was colonized as well, obviously British Columbia and such.
Right.
So there's a lot of history to be said. But yet again, like the forethought that education will save communities and generations, I think that's something that we have to hold on to, because that's one of the things that's being attacked for a reason. Like they know that's the one thing that has been a focal point in trying to teach younger generations how to continue to move forward with their culture and their community strong. And we know that's kind of what's happening with the dismantling of the Department of Education, the dismantling of DEI, the dismantling of those who can get further education. Like there's so much in that conversation here. I hate that it's cyclical and that we're back here, but these are good reminders. Once again, I think that's the bigger part, is that people still strive and fight during these times, I guess.
Yeah. And on top of just not only the dismantling of education, but the control of the education that is disseminated to people. So it's like, okay, you must teach in English, or this is a curriculum you have to have. This is what can and can't be included in a curriculum, not based on any sort of scientific and long-lasting research, just because of people's propaganda and people's misinformed and disinformed opinions. And that was the case. And not only misinformed and disinformed, also purposefully harmful opinions.
Purposely. Right.
Yeah, purposely.
And I'm glad for people like you, Yves, who bring these people to us so we don't forget what is happening and who they are and how important they are and were.
Thank you. I'm happy to. I think it's nice to have a community and be in community with people who care about these things. So shout out to everyone listening and to y'all too.
Yes, to our community who cares to learn.
Yes. Yes. But yeah, thank you so much, Yves, for bringing these stories to us, these very important stories. When you're traveling all over, when you're from the car, we really appreciate it.
No problem.
It's always a delight.
It is.
Well, Yves, where can the good listeners find you?
Y'all can go to my website, which is yvesjeffcoat.com. I'll spell that YVESJEFFCOAT.com. And you can pretty much get to everything from there. You can sign up for my newsletter, which you get a free meditation with that is about nature, by the way. You can also get to like a contact form from there. Hit me up. You can also go to Instagram. I'm on Instagram at apologizing. And if you're interested in nature and travel and things like that, since we kind of started talking about that at the beginning of this episode, you can go to my YouTube channel, which is Otherworld Outdoors, which I also cover Black history in the outdoors and outdoor travel, things like that on the channel. So any of the avenues, I would love to hear from you. And of course, many other episodes of Sminty Here, Female First, where we talk about plenty of other people in history that if you're interested and loved today's episode, I think you'll like those too. That's all.
Yes. And listeners, go check out Yves and all the avenues, because it's amazing content you produce. So go check Yves out, listeners. If you would like to contact us, you can email us at hello@stuffInevertoldyou.com. You can find us on Blue Sky at Mom Stuff Podcast, or on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff I Never Told You. We're also on YouTube. We have a TeePublic store, and we have a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks, as always, to our super producer, Christina, our executive producer, Maya, and our contributor, Joey.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff I Never Told You is a production by iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your favorite shows.